All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly critical, honestly fascinating analysis by political scientist Dr. Majid Rafizadeh. We're looking at the geopolitical fallout of the recently signed U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding. You know, if you follow international relations, you already know that any diplomatic shift in this region sends shockwaves literally across the globe. But what happens when a major agreement is viewed not as a step toward peace, but as a massive strategic miscalculation? Dr. Rafizadeh's analysis absolutely pulls no punches, and we are going to deconstruct exactly why he argues this framework is a strategic failure with huge global implications. So let's just dive right in. I want to start right off the bat with this really striking quote drawn straight from the source material. The MOU is a deal to talk about a deal. The foundational argument here is that this is not some finalized peace treaty, right? It's a temporary pause. And according to the analysis, it's a pause that essentially rewards blackmail. The author contends that by agreeing to this framework, the United States is basically choosing to give up its leverage right at the absolute most critical moment of pressure. To tackle this critique systematically, we're going to look at 5 key areas. 1. The framework agreement. 2. A history of deceit. 3. Rearmament and terror proxies. 4. Global security consequences. And 5. Demands for verifiable action. Section 1. The framework agreement. Examining the concessions. According to the analysis, this June 17th Memorandum of Understanding, signed by Donald J. Trump and Masoud Pezeshkian, grants incredibly lopsided leverage to the Iranian regime. The author points out a really stark contrast in the concessions being made here. The U.S. removes the blockade, extends a 60-day ceasefire, reopens the Strait of Hormuz to shipping, and promises up to $300 billion in funding. Meanwhile, what does Iran get? They get to keep their enriched uranium and centrifuges totally intact. They resume and even expand their oil exports, and crucially, they buy incredibly valuable time for regime survival. The source argues this isn't a balanced compromise at all. It's a scenario where the regime secures hundreds of billions of dollars while hanging on to the exact nuclear infrastructure the West wants to dismantle. Section 2. A history of deceit. The trust deficit. So, can we trust that giving them this breathing room will actually lead to a better, permanent deal? Well, the analysis says, absolutely not, pointing to a legendary pattern of broken commitments. The author contrasts the hopeful diplomatic goals of the West, things like regional de-escalation, economic promises, verbal commitments to treaties, with what they argue is the stark reality of the regime. Historically, the source notes, the regime signs basically whatever is necessary to get economic relief, only to turn around and pursue its own aggressive agenda in secret. They covertly enrich uranium, secretly support proxy militias, and advance ideological hostility. It's an ongoing cycle of securing funds and then totally evading actual compliance. Which leads us to this pretty harsh conclusion from the text. The source contends that because the regime's foundation is so deeply rooted in anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, and hostility toward its own people, expecting moderation just because financial pressure is lifted is a deeply flawed strategy. As the author notes, the core ideology hasn't shifted one bit, and the probability of it doing so is practically zero. You literally cannot buy ideological moderation. Section 3. Rearmament and terror proxies. Funding the front lines. If the ideology hasn't changed and the regime's history points to deceit, we really have to ask a very practical question about this new MOU. What actually happens with the massive influx of cash authorized by this framework? The author zeroes in on this staggering figure, $300 billion. Just let that sink in for a second. The critique argues that instead of using this for civil reconstruction or domestic investment, this newly acquired wealth and lifted pressure just gives the regime the breathing room it desperately needs to drastically escalate its military and terror operations. According to the analysis, that is exactly where the money is going. The funds will flow directly into replenishing ballistic missiles damaged in recent conflicts. Notably, the author points out a major expected expansion in attack drone development, which the regime sees as a highly effective way to project power asymmetrically. Furthermore, a huge chunk of this income is going straight to the axis of resistance. We're talking about providing critical funding, advanced weapons, and strategic guidance to Hezbollah in Lebanon, arming Hamas, and supporting the Houthis. By empowering these proxies, the analysis explains, the regime can severely destabilize the region and pressure adversaries like Israel, all without incurring any direct costs to Tehran itself. It's a very calculated move. Section 4. Global security consequences. The ripple effect. Now, if you're watching this from outside the Middle East, you might be wondering, why does this specific framework agreement impact me? Well, the author outlines a terrifying step-by-step escalation that this MOU allegedly sets into motion, showing how regional empowerment very quickly becomes a global crisis. Step 1. The regime uses this 60-day window just to outlast current U.S. administrative pressures and secure its own survival. Step 2. Feeling emboldened, the regime could start demanding fees from shipping companies passing through the Strait of Hormuz. The author warns this could essentially trigger the end of freedom of the seas worldwide, extorting global trade through the constant threat of drone or missile strikes. And finally, Step 3. As international constraints ease up and the world's attention shifts elsewhere, the regime covertly resumes full nuclear weapons development. They do this operating under the assumption that future administrations just won't have the resolve to stop them. They act this way because, as the source points out, they truly believe their defiance has just been massively rewarded.
Section 5. Demands for verifiable action. The required alternative.
Okay, so if the author views this MOU as a critical failure that actively endangers the world, what is the realistic alternative? How do we break this 50-year cycle of destabilization? Dr. Rafizade's analysis concludes by demanding clear-eyed realism, insisting that only ironclad, verifiable actions are going to work here. The demands are absolute. First, the regime must completely surrender its entire enriched uranium stockpile, period. Second, it must totally dismantle its nuclear program, not just put it on pause. Third, it has to completely stop the production of all ballistic missiles. And finally, it must immediately and verifiably sever all financial and tactical support for its terrorist proxies. The author's ultimate takeaway is that without strict enforcement of these total disarmament demands, lifting pressure doesn't buy peace. It simply funds a brutal dictatorship's dangerous playbook. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative question drawn right from the heart of the analysis. Can global security be maintained by striking deals with a regime that views defiance as a victory? The source strongly argues that the answer is a resounding no, challenging us to look way beyond the immediate relief of a temporary ceasefire and really consider the true long-term costs of these diplomatic concessions. Thanks for joining me to unpack this really complex issue today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.